This is week 4, and this week we're talking about classical music. So don't forget, classical music has two meanings. Number one, it's this umbrella term that talks about all of the music we're learning about this semester in this class. That begins with medieval music, going to Renaissance, Baroque, this type of music that's called classical, as well as the next unit, which will focus on Romantic music and then 20th century music. However, within that, there is this subgenre called classical music, which refers specifically from 1750, the year Bach died, to 1820. Now, I would argue that the three most important classical composers, again, classical meaning this specific subgenre, for the rest of this lecture, if I say classical, unless I specify, assume that I mean this period from 1750 to 1820. So of the classical composers, I will argue that there are three that are the most important: Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. However, in this lecture, I'm only going to focus on Haydn and Mozart because Beethoven, while he's a very important classical composer, he also is the person who, I'm going to argue, initiates and begins the Romantic genre, which will be the next one. So because Beethoven segues into Romantic music, I'll discuss Beethoven next week. So this is classical music, classical composers with a special emphasis on Haydn and Mozart. So the Enlightenment was a period of time when reason, logic, and higher thought was in vogue, was the big movement of the era. The United States is a product of the Enlightenment. The French Revolution, well, the good parts about the French Revolution, the country that France eventually became, is a product of the Enlightenment. There are numerous different historical documents and figures we can talk about with regard to the Enlightenment, but of course, because this is a music class, we're going to focus on specifically how it impacts music, how it was informed by music, and how music was informed by the Enlightenment. The first composer that the book mentions is Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, usually shortened to CPE Bach. So Bach was Johann Sebastian Bach's son. He had many sons, many children, with 2 wives. However, CPE Bach is arguably the composer of his children who has the most successful career. In fact, at the time, CPE Bach had a more successful life as a composer than his father did. Now, looking back, CPE is still regarded as a great composer, but of course his father is considered the great one. If we say Bach, we refer to Johann Sebastian, not Carl Philipp Emanuel. If you want an example of one of CPE Bach's greatest pieces of music, listen to Solfeggietto. So going through here, one thing that's interesting about classical music is it really has one city that it came out of, Vienna. When you think of the origins of classical music, you want to think Vienna. There aren't really many genres where we can say that that's true. One of them would be opera. And if you remember from last week, opera is an Italian art form. Of course, it spread across Europe, and eventually other European countries began composing operas, or rather the composers from those countries began composing operas in their vernacular. German operas from Germany, English operas from England, and so on. However, for a long time, even operas composed in those other countries were in Italian. So the opera is an Italian genre, classical music is from Vienna. There is one person that we need to talk about, one political figure, who is Joseph II. And he was one of the most important figures in furthering the Enlightenment and enlightened ideas. So again, democracy is one example of an enlightened idea. Social justice, equality for all people, not giving preferential treatment to the wealthy, the aristocracy, or the clergy, that all men are created equal. This is one of the most important ideas out of the Enlightenment. And it's one thing for a philosopher to have this idea. It's another thing for a person in power to have this idea. Someone who is an emperor, who has the power to effect real change. And that's exactly what Joseph II is known for. To give you an idea of this, and this is listed in the beginning of chapter 12, during his reign, which was only for about 10 years, we saw the emancipation of the peasantry, great advancements in education, a reduction in the power of clergy, and he supported music and literature with his patronage and encouraged free press. So when we say that he encouraged it with his patronage, music at this time, if you wanted to be a composer, almost certainly you had someone paying you to write that. It was commissioned. You wouldn't just sit around and write operas or symphonies because someone had to be responsible for you getting your bills paid. So you would write music for other people. So one thing that Joseph did is he would commission composers to write music for him, specifically to support the arts. It's not that he wanted music played for him like some of these figures in Baroque music would insist on, that they had to have the very best of everything. Joseph's motivation was to support the local arts. In his city, which had only 150,000 people, which is a lot, it's about the size of, say, Omaha, Nebraska today, he had 300 newspapers, free press newspapers that could print whatever they want. They could criticize him if they wanted to. Freedom of the press, freedom of religion, these are all ideas that, again, they're in the Bill of Rights because the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence, and the Constitution are very much products of the Age of Enlightenment. Public education is a product of the Age of Enlightenment. Most of us went to public schools, or we may have gone to private schools or been homeschooled, but that was a choice. We had free public education available to us, which is an Enlightenment age idea. And in fact, in our music education courses here at Johnson, we specifically talk about the fact that today's model is in so many ways exactly the same as it was back during the Enlightenment, the second half of the 18th century. And is it time to update it or not? It's been updated in some ways, but fundamentally it hasn't been. And in the very introduction, the prelude to the chapter, it even identifies Franz Joseph Haydn, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, and Ludwig van Beethoven, even though, as I mentioned, we're not going to talk about Beethoven until next week because he's an important figure in the transition from classical to romantic music. Even though this music, classical music, comes from Vienna, France is certainly the center of enlightenment. These are French philosophers who are originally producing these ideas. Social injustice, of course, the pursuit of happiness. So the pursuit of happiness, does it relate to music? Well, indirectly it does, because you can get to the point where you start to enjoy music for music's sake. It doesn't have to only be associated with these specific reasons that a king or a monarch would lay out, or with the church. You can listen to music just for the sake of enjoying the music. And some of the same philosophers, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, for example, who were important figures in the Enlightenment philosophy, Thomas Jefferson would of course be another one, Benjamin Franklin, all of these people who we think of as the founding fathers of America, they are Enlightenment philosophers. But Jean-Jacques Rousseau was himself a talented musician who worked in music for a very long time. Music as entertainment. That leads us to the way concerts have changed. By this point, changes in the sociology and the economy of Europe have led to the idea of a public concert, very often a free public concert. It becomes important to musicians to play for the people, play for the masses. This idea that all of a sudden regular people get to hear music on a pretty standard basis compared to, again, I know I keep drilling these same ideas, but I think it's important to understand that before, if you weren't either at church on a Sunday or at a synagogue on a Friday night or a monarch, you're probably not going to hear music. You may hear folk music played in your town or your village, but largely you're not going to hear very much music. However, with the rise of public concerts comes this idea of a rock star. Now, was the term rock star used back then? Of course not. It's a modern term, 20th century term in America. However, the idea is the same, that there are these musicians who are so popular. People know them, people love them, people can't wait to hear the music, they get excited, they line up. It becomes a focal point of their year, planning that, oh my goodness, Mozart's coming to town. We have tickets to see Mozart, we can't wait, and he shows up, and there's just crowds of people that are so excited to see him perform. This idea starts to develop at this point. Remember, Bach, who is today remembered as one of the great composers of the Baroque era, wasn't really that well known outside of music circles during his time. However, Mozart will become famous. He will become a celebrity. Haydn will become a celebrity. However, neither of them compare to the level of celebrity that Beethoven will achieve next time. One of the most important aspects of style in classical music is the emphasis on order and structure. If I were to choose one stylistic characteristic that I thought was the most important in Baroque, I would say it is ornamentation. That things are decorated, there are virtuosic opportunities for musicians to show off. However, in classical music, it's much more simplified. I'm going to come back to this idea in a little bit, but it's about order and structure. It's almost like doing a math problem. Everything has to fit together in a very particular way, and when you're composing this music, there are certain patterns and very, very many rules that you have to follow. Now, who came up with these rules? Well, no one, in a sense. What sounds good in music to a Western conditioned ear is a product of composers figuring out what works for them and what they think sounds good. This is very similar to mathematics. No one decided one day that 2 plus 2 is 4. It just is. We noticed that if one person has 2 apples in one hand and 2 apples in another, they have 4 apples. Is that a rule in math? Yes, you could argue that, but really it's just a natural law. And we can say that the rules of music are similar to natural laws, in that Bach and Palestrina and these composers we've talked about before now, even Vivaldi to an extent, were figuring things out, and they had certain patterns, certain things they would do. They have certain notes that they wouldn't play together. If you're a musician, you know you probably don't want to play C, E, and F sharp together. It's not going to sound very good. There are certain rules and practices that become standardized by this point. And in classical music, it's about following these rules and doing as much as you can within the confines of the rules. It's not that it's basic, it's not that it's simplified. If anything, it's like doing a really complex crossword puzzle or Sudoku or something. There are rules you have to follow, and how creative can you be within these rules? What can you do within these rules? So order and structure are the most important aspects of classical music. We also begin to see some changes in dynamics. Before it was loud or soft, kind of on or off, and there were these abrupt changes in Baroque music. However, in classical music, we see the introduction of the crescendo and the diminuendo, also sometimes called a decrescendo. A crescendo is when you slowly get louder, and a diminuendo is when you slowly get softer. And those symbols would be written in music, and now we can have gradual changes, either over the course of a section of music, or a measure of music, or a few notes, but we have new symbols for these changes. Crescendo and diminuendo, it seems so standard for musicians today, but those are a product of classical music. And tone color, this is one of the most exciting elements of classical music. This is something that we overlook today. But for those of you who are musicians, especially those of you who play the keyboard or the synthesizer, imagine you are working at a DAW, and a digital audio workstation, you're working on your computer, and you're using a program such as Pro Tools, Logic, even MainStage, GarageBand, something like that, Ableton. You're using some program where you're creating patches, creating samples, adjusting the tone, or if you're a guitar player, you have your guitar amp, you're turning the treble up, you're turning some reverb on, you're switching to a different amp setting, you're adding some chorus. All these changes, we take for granted how easy it is to change our tone, especially on electric instruments today. However, back then, how do you create new sounds? Well, to an extent you can't. We just have the instruments we have. It's a very slow process to introduce new instruments. The way you would create new sounds, tone colors, is by layering instruments together. How does an oboe sound when it plays in unison with a French horn? How does a trumpet sound when it plays in unison with a violin or a flute or a cello? By combining different instruments together to play at the same time, either in unison, meaning they're playing the same notes, or in harmony, meaning they're playing different harmonious notes that sound good together, you're creating almost new patches or new samples and new sounds that hadn't been heard. And this is something that even I've experienced as a person who's studied music very extensively. Sometimes I'll listen to a classical music piece and I'll hear 2 instruments or 3 or so layered on top of each other, and I won't know right away what exactly they're doing. How are they getting that sound? Is that a clarinet with a violin or a viola, or is that an oboe? And surprisingly, it's sometimes difficult to tell, but you can get some very interesting sounds that way. So layering instruments together, tone color. One of the technological developments, and yes, it is considered a technological development, one of the technological developments that most allowed for these different tone colors was the invention of the orchestra. So this is considered a technical development that was spurred by the invention of the symphony. So what is a symphony? A lot of people think that the symphony and the orchestra is the same thing. We say, I'm going to the symphony tonight, or I'm going to the orchestra tonight. We're going to dive into that more in a few moments, but here's the quick answer. An orchestra is a group of musicians. A symphony is a genre of music. Yes, today those names are used interchangeably. There will be a few other terms in this lecture that are used interchangeably. However, just to keep everything clear, for this lecture and true of this time period, if I say orchestra, I'm referring to a group of musicians, a group of many musicians. If I say symphony, I'm referring to a specific genre of music that we'll talk about later today. In your book, you have the section on tone color of the classical orchestra. So you see that in the early Baroque period, the ensemble was pretty small. You had some violins, you had violas a little bit larger violin, you had cellos, which are the larger ones that you play sitting down, and you had the bass, which was at this point still a relatively new instrument, and you may have had a harpsichord or an organ. Then when you get to festive Baroque, you have a first and second violin, you have the viola, cello, bass, but we're adding some woodwind and brass instruments. You have 2 oboes, a bassoon, 3 trumpets, 2 timpani, which are boom, 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 2 very large drums that you would play. And then again, you have the harpsichord or the organ. But by the time we get to the classical orchestra, we have first violins, second violins, violas, cellos, basses, 2 flutes, 2 oboes, 2 clarinets, 2 bassoons, 2 French horns, 2 trumpets, and the 2 timpani. You'll notice that keyboard instruments are no longer listed, though the harpsichord or the organ are not there right now. Now, will there be piano or keyboard music or harpsichord music with the classical orchestra? Yes, there will be concertos for the harpsichord or for keyboards. However, we'll talk about those in specific instances, for example, Mozart's. However, generally, that instrument is no longer considered part of the classical orchestra. We see a difference in melody as well. I mentioned this earlier, but in Baroque music, we emphasized ornamentation. Virtuosic, sometimes they use the term pyrotechnics, which refers to doing stuff with fire, but they use the term pyrotechnics to refer to very intricate, fast, difficult to play musical passages. We've moved away from that, almost a rejection of that. By the time we get to classical music, the melodies are very plain, very simple, and very straightforward. They're still beautiful, they're still very impressive, but they're relatively plain, especially compared to Baroque music. Now, this may seem strange that we're getting further along in history, but the music is, in at least this sense, getting simpler. However, this is a trend that we see all the time throughout music. To give you just 2 examples, in the 1930s and 40s, we had big band music of Duke Ellington and Gershwin and Glenn Miller. Then we went to the 1950s and we get rock and roll. So much simpler. These lush chords with a full jazz orchestra had been replaced with a guitar, a saxophone, bass, drums, and a vocalist. Then the same thing happens. In the 1980s, we have hair metal. Groups like Van Halen and Poison is perhaps one of the greatest examples, Motley Crue, of these shredding guitar players just playing 1,000,000 notes per minute. And then we get to the 90s and we see grunge, where we go the opposite, the complete opposite direction. We get Kurt Cobain and we get other groups where the emphasis is on simplicity. So this is a trend, an ebb and flow. We go from virtuosic playing to simple, relatively, it's not that it's unimpressive, it's just less busy playing. The texture is clearly homophonic, meaning there is a melody. There's a very clear melody. Even within an orchestra, maybe the clarinets have the melody, and in that section of the orchestra, that section of the symphony, the other instruments are supporting that clarinet melody, or maybe on the piano, the right hand is clearly playing the melody and the left hand is supporting the right hand. But it will be homophonic, there will be a very clear melody in practically all the songs you listen to. We have some classical forms that begin to emerge. Sonata form, minuet, rondo, theme and variations. We discussed the rondo last week. It was very similar to the ritornello. The most important form of classical music is the sonata form, also called the sonata allegro form. And as I mentioned, the textbook continues to emphasize this point, but the invention of the orchestra was considered a technological development to allow for tone color so that the music could just go in all sorts of new directions sonically. Now that we're in chapter 13, you're going to get a layout of the symphony. You have the opening movement, which is a sonata or sonata allegro. That's what we'll talk about in just a moment. Then the second movement is a slow movement. The third movement is a minuet, or it's in 3/4. And then finally you have a closing movement, which will also be fast. So, sonata allegro form. This began with binary form, something we discussed in week 3 as well as way back in week 1. So binary form, you have the A section and the B section. You play something in the A section, you play something different in the B section. Well, after a while, composers started to play with this idea and say, well, let's go back to the A section, but now we're going to use something called A prime. So in your music, if you see an apostrophe following the second A, or sometimes it even looks like a little 1 exponent, that's called prime. So that means it's similar to the A section, but it's different in some way. Maybe it's shorter, maybe it's in a different key, but it's very close to the first one, close enough where we can clearly call it the A section, but different enough where we have to specify that it's not exactly the same. So even though sonata form is sometimes described as A, B, A prime, we are going to be much more specific. So it has 3 sections. The first section is called the exposition. Think of it this way, you're exposing the melody. This is your chance to take the melody that you wrote as a composer and put it on display. Play it with the full orchestra. Then you have the development, the B, or the second section here. In the development, you take the primary melody or theme of the A section and you do all sorts of interesting things with it. You put in a different key, you change the notes, you flip it around. It clearly started as it clearly started as the first theme, but you're doing very interesting things with it. Then finally you get to the third section, which is the recapitulation, where you recap the melody. You play the melody from the beginning again. So these terms, exposition, development, and recapitulation, they may seem hard to remember, but again, you expose the melody, you show it for the first time, you develop the melody, and then you recap it at the end. Exposition, development, recapitulation. In the earliest sonata forms, which are what we'll be primarily listening to this week, the development is, I think you'll find that it's interesting, certainly, but it's not nearly as ambitious as the developments that you'll start to hear in future weeks. So for example, right now, in the earliest symphonies, in the earliest sonatas, you may hear that the A section and the B section are roughly equal in length. However, by the time we get to next week, especially with Beethoven and late Beethoven, you'll hear that the exposition, the melody, is almost something that the composers seem to want to get out of the way. And the exciting part is about the development. Now that we've taken some idea, how can we do amazing things with it? And the recap is almost certainly going to be much shorter than the exposition. Again, you're just reminding the audience of that original theme. You can also use the analogy of writing a paper. You have your introductory paragraph where you talk about your idea, you state your thesis, that would be the main theme, and that's the exposition. Then you have the development, which is the body of your paper where you flesh out these ideas. You flesh out these ideas. Then you have the recapitulation, which is your concluding paragraph where you restate your thesis and you synthesize these ideas together. There's a really useful graphic under the recapitulation which shows this yellow bar which represents the keys, starts in one place, goes up a little, goes to this unstable section of development where things go all over the place, you have no idea where it's going to go, and then finally by the recapitulation, we come back to something familiar. I encourage you to read, well, of course, the whole textbook, the whole section for this week very carefully, but please pay very careful attention to the section on Mozart's Symphony No. 40 in G minor. This is going to be the theme song of this unit of the course. And there is a little mnemonic device almost that I want you to use to remember this. It's a bird, it's a plane, it's Mozart. So think about those. It's a bird, it's a plane, it's a Mozart. Use those terms, use those words to remember this melody. We have this wonderful biography on Wolfgang, or Wolfgang with a V, Amadeus Mozart, 1756 to 1791, an unfortunately very short life. Born in Salzburg, which was in Austria. And again, he's one of these Viennese composers from Vienna. His father, Leopold, was a court musician, and he's one of these really tough figures where you get an idea that Mozart was certainly pushed into music. Mozart showed extraordinary talent from a very young age. His first symphony was played when he was 8 years old by a professional orchestra. The future Queen Marie Antoinette, who would unfortunately be beheaded, the wife of Louis XVI during the French Revolution, she was amused by Mozart when he would, she would play games with him. If you know what perfect pitch is, it's when you can hear a pitch. A person can hear a note played on the piano or a violin or a trumpet or any instrument and say that's a G, that's an A flat, that's a B, that's a D sharp. You can hear the note and know what it is. Mozart had perfect pitch and he could do this. In 1781, when Mozart is 25 years old, he decides to quit his job. He had been working as a court musician, as his father did, and there was a heated exchange. Things got a little bit ugly, but he left. Compare this to what happened to Bach a generation or maybe 2 generations earlier. Bach went to jail. Before that, someone probably would have just been beheaded. So that's another sign of this age of enlightenment, that things that previously wouldn't have been allowed are becoming more and more commonplace. First you would have been killed, then you go to jail, then you get in a big ugly fight, but you're allowed to leave, and then in future generations we'll see you want to quit a job, you just quit the job. Between 1782 and 1785, Mozart is responsible for a lot of his own concerts, many of which are piano concertos. If you remember from last week, a concerto is when you have one person playing a primary melody, the lead part almost, and the orchestra is accompanying them. So Mozart would write and perform these. He would also have improvisational periods. Sometimes he would solo and improvise a part as he goes, but there was almost always an overture by somebody else. So think of this as an opening band. Mozart is the headliner, he's the big one playing, but some other composer could come perform an overture, an opening piece. After an extremely successful career, Mozart dies suddenly at the age of 35. Now, he died of unknown causes. There are all sorts of theories, and it even suggests that he was perhaps poisoned by Salieri, who was he was depicted in the video last week of Mozart as a court musician, or Salieri was a court musician, Mozart came in, and the piece of music was to honor Mozart. There were all sorts of rumors. None of them can be substantiated. Modern medical experts still disagree. One of the most prominent ideas, it was featured in a New York Times article about 10 years ago now, was that based on his conditions and the time and the place and everything, if they had to guess what it was, they'd probably say it was strep throat, which very rarely kills people today, but of course all sorts of diseases could have killed someone in the 1700s. There are a list of his most important pieces at the bottom. They're all great. However, a few that really stand out to me are The Marriage of Figaro, Don Giovanni, The Magic Flute, all of which are operas. And fun fact, the opera was Mozart's favorite genre to compose for. We also have his symphony in G minor, Jupiter, Ein klein Nachtmusik, which I'm sure you've all heard before. A lot of great pieces, and I encourage you to listen to all of them. All right, let's switch to Haydn. So we talked about where Mozart came from, but where does this guy come from? Well, we're not sure. He was Haydn. Lame joke. You get a few lame jokes. That's this one. So, Franz Joseph Haydn, not Haydn, Haydn. He was a contemporary of Mozart. He was actually already performing around the same time. For a very brief moment, they actually played together, Mozart and Haydn, in an amateur string quartet. So he has many famous pieces, and he specifically thought of one of the classical composers. If you think Haydn, think classical music. But one in particular that we're really going to emphasize to give you an idea of Haydn is this, what was part of the London Symphonies. There is one in particular called, well, its nickname is the Surprise. So its official name is just number 94 in G major. We didn't really have names for pieces of music yet. That's something that'll start to happen with Beethoven. However, this one does have a nickname. It's called the Surprise, and we're going to talk about why. So it's in the second movement. So the first movement begins with a sonata, very standard sonata form. And then the joke is in the second movement. It's supposed to be this slower piece. and out of nowhere, the orchestra has this loud hit. Surprise! Now, if that doesn't sound like much of a surprise to you, I'm sure you're not alone. I bet everyone in this class, with the exception of those who've already studied Haydn and the Surprise Symphony, are probably wondering what's so surprising about that. The book does a really good job explaining that. However, there's another video posted this week with a wonderful explanation of the Surprise Symphony. So I will let you turn to that for a deeper explanation. However, basically, he just defied expectations. The sonata form was such standard practice that people thought they knew what to expect when they'd go to see something, and they had this very loud, very surprising, very exciting moment. One other thing I'll say about that is that today, when we think of going to an opera or going to professional musical theater or going to see a symphony orchestra perform, we imagine that everyone gets dressed up and you sit very quietly and you don't clap between movements, and at the end you show your appreciation with an applause. That was not true of this day, especially for Haydn. This was more like a rock concert. He wanted people to participate and get excited and ooh and ah as he would do different unexpected things. So he almost certainly got a huge reaction out of this surprise, and there are documented testimonies of women fainting and people cheering, all sorts of things that you'll learn about in greater detail in that video. But that is the exemplary song that we'll use for Haydn, the Surprise Symphony. For Franz Joseph Haydn, who just went by Joseph, or Joseph, I'm sure it would have been, we have his biography in here as well. So Mozart, Bach, they were both descended from families of musicians. Haydn was not. That really set him apart. But again, you want to talk about Age of Enlightenment, this is yet one more moment when you get to choose your own life. No more do we have this system where you do what your parents did. Nope, you can choose whatever career you want. He wanted to be a musician. So he had an important job where he was writing music and overseeing music for a court, where he had to be able to write operas, he had to be able to oversee theater and chamber music. Chamber music is, you can think of it as just classical music, usually played inside. Orchestra performances, and he did a great job. He was hiring his own musicians. He composed 104 symphonies. That's very impressive. No one composes 104 symphonies today. And why is that? Is it because no one's as talented or as skilled as Haydn? No, actually there's a very specific reason, and we'll talk about that more when we get to Beethoven's career. But it should stand out. It's very impressive. 104 is a tremendous number of symphonies. As I mentioned before, by the 1780s, he befriended Mozart, and the two actually played together. The spread of Haydn's international fame led to the acceleration of public concerts. So again, public concerts are an important aspect of the Enlightenment. So he was one of the more exciting people to talk to and to see and to hear. He was, in testimonies we have, very friendly, very outgoing, very social, kind of a fun guy to be around. And that's interesting because that is the complete opposite of Mozart and Beethoven, the other two really important classical composers. Both of them were a bit socially awkward, kind of ornery, very difficult to work with. You get this idea of the creative genius who can't be bothered, who orders people around because he needs to have his vision seen. That wasn't Haydn. Haydn seems like he was a pretty cool guy. There's a very interesting quote about Haydn, who did outlive Mozart by quite a few years. And he says, "Friends often flatter me that I have some genius." And then it breaks the quote in here to say, he once said, without contradicting them, so he says, "My friends say I'm a genius." Subtext, they're right. But then he goes on to say, "But Mozart stood far above me." And I think that's true. I think it's true. Haydn's incredible. But Mozart is, I mentioned last week, Bach, Mozart, and Beethoven are the three most important people in this entire class. Really, I mean, think about that. We're talking about 1,000 years of music, and Mozart is in the top three. He really is just an incredibly important figure. Music would not be the way it is today without him. And Haydn, one of the other great musicians of this time period, knew that, recognized it, and had no problem admitting it. At the beginning of chapter 14, talks about some other genres. Now the sonata can mean two things. It's the first movement of most symphonies, but it can also be a short piece for the piano. Now, when it's a short piece for the piano, it's very often also in sonata form, although it doesn't necessarily have to be. In Italian, sonata just means sounded. So that kind of makes sense, that it's sounded, it's a piece of music, so it can have multiple meanings. So just keep that in mind, that sometimes when we say sonata, like Mozart's Sonata K545 in C major, which is one of the songs that you'll listen to, that song is not an orchestra, right? It's not a symphony being played by an orchestra, obviously. It's this other meaning of sonata. It's a piece it's a composition for one or sometimes two instruments only. And you'll hear the difference. The difference is, are you hearing only a keyboard instrument, like a piano or harpsichord, or are you hearing an entire orchestra? I keep saying piano. The music is played on piano today. It would have been played at a harpsichord at this time. We're not quite to the piano yet, although we're getting very close. So the sonata, again, the keyboard version of the sonata, is very important in its setting because it's meant to be played and in people's homes. It's a domestic performance for private performances. You have company over, you would have a sonata performed. It's not a public concert, it's not in a church, it's not in a theater, it is a private performance. If you want a public concert, that would be a symphony performing, that would be an orchestra performing a symphony. If you want a church performance, that would be a mass or an oratorio, something like that. And if you have performance in a theater, that would be an opera. But private in your homes, that would be what these sonatas are most often written for. The classical concerto. Now, the concerto is no different in terms of what it is than it was in the Baroque period, but the important difference is that the orchestra is growing, and we have this new emphasis on tone color. So what do you do in that case when it used to be one person playing off of just a few people, now it's one person playing against quite a bit more, sometimes even double. So how do you make that adjustment? Well, perhaps the best person to figure out a balance was Mozart. And this is talked about at great length in the section in chapter 14, section 2, called the classical concerto. Basically what Mozart would do is he would take the soloist, and if you're the person playing the lead part in a concerto, you are almost certainly one of the most amazing musicians around, perhaps in your city or in your country or perhaps internationally. But there's this assumption that the person leading the concerto is probably the best musician in the room, right? So you take the soloist's greater ability, brilliance, and expressive capability compared to the orchestra's increased power. They're so loud because there's so many people, and they're probably playing brass instruments, woodwind instruments, giant percussion instruments like the timpani, and their variety in tone color. The contestants are perfectly matched, and no one emerges as the winner. It's just a great match where everything's balanced. So you get the best player on one instrument who can do all sorts of incredible things, and then on the other side you get this enormous ensemble that can be very loud and has this tone color and expression, and when you put them together, you get this great performance. That's how concertos are realized in the classical era. The string quartet begins to emerge. Opera buffa. So, operas were pretty serious. A lot of serious subject matter. The operas that we've focused on in this course so far have been based off of Greek tragedies. So by this point, now that we're continuing to move away from sacred music is still happening, but it doesn't have to be sacred. Then we had serious operas, and now we're getting comedic operas, a musical comedy, if you will. Now this term buffo is an Italian variation, buffone, on buffoon. So it's just silly, almost like an idiot, just someone who's goofing around, being a buffoon. Now what's very interesting is by this point we have funny, happy, feel-good operas with all sorts of tricks and hijinks along the way. And in many respects, opera buffa sets the stage for musical theater. That pun was intended. One important difference, though, in opera buffa is if you're going for comedy, your performers have to be able to act. Before, if you had a great voice, you could get up there and you could sing your heart out, right? But now you also have to be funny, you have to have comedic timing, you have to be able to act. That's an important development. That means that a lot of people who were very successful at opera seria, serious operas, what preceded opera buffa, may or may not have a career. It depends on how good of an actor they are. Joseph II, who we talked about earlier, was an active promoter of the comic opera. So again, just one more thing that he did for the music and the arts community. The opera seria, we can think of Handel from last time. The opera buffa, we can think more of Haydn and Mozart. Within an opera buffa, there is a song type called an ensemble, or ensemble. So an ensemble, today if we talk about an ensemble with regard to an opera or musical theater, it refers to the whole group of people, the entire cast. In this setting, it refers to when two or more people, sometimes the whole cast, are singing together. So just keep that in mind when it's talking about the ensemble, that's what it's referring to in this context. It's a piece of music where multiple people are singing. Opera buffa also showed contemporary people in comic situations compared to, again, these Greek tragedies like Orfeo. The story of Orpheus goes back thousands of years, and it's about someone going down and interacting with the gods. That's so far removed from having a romantic interest in your neighbor, something like that. One of the most important operas of this time period, and the opera that this textbook author really wants to focus on, which is perfectly fine. Personally, I would say The Magic Flute is my favorite Mozart opera, but Don Giovanni is also incredible. 1787, written for a performance in Prague. Prague is the capital of Bohemia, modern-day Czech Republic, which was the second largest city in the Austrian Empire at the time. And it's considered a dark comedy because almost like sort of a Judd Apatow style of piece, because it combined opera buffa with opera seria. Very serious elements. It has murder, it has things like that, which it doesn't play off as a joke. The killing is serious and the subject matter is serious, but at the same time, they're approaching it in a lighthearted way. And in many respects, that's how life is. Life isn't always happy. Life isn't always sad and dark and serious. Life is a combination. And this play, this opera buffa, shows both sides of it. So in that sense, it combines opera seria with opera buffa. So Don Giovanni is the Italian equivalent for Don Juan, which is a legendary Spanish libertine. So a libertine is a type of person, and what's really interesting is I was trying to look up some definitions of libertine to give you an official definition for this lecture, and I came across many definitions, and some of them really shine libertines in a negative light, and others shine them in a more positive light. So let's start with the more negative light. Libertines are people who are devoid of principles, responsibilities, ability to restrain themselves sexually. Sometimes they're even amoral, at least depending on society's perception of what morality is. That's one definition. Another definition is someone who's a free thinker, who lives life by their own rules, regardless of what society thinks. However, even though that second one is far more flattering of a libertine, a few ideas are pretty much associated with a libertine by everyone. Being a womanizer and alcohol consumption. This is a bit of a side note, but if you refer to someone as a Don Juan, also Don Giovanni, that's meaning that they're a womanizer, that they're trying to seduce many women, play many women, and that is certainly a theme within the opera Don Giovanni. So let's jump into what's going on. Has these endless escapades and conquests, incredulous laughter by the audience. Don Giovanni is compulsive and completely selfishly pursuing women. He ignores the rules of society, morality, and God. I'm paraphrasing the textbook's synopsis of the story. Has serious undertones. He commits crimes and moral sins. He kills the father of one of his victims. Finally, he's brought down, and while hiding in a graveyard during one of his adventures, making blasphemous jokes, he is approached by a marble statue who can talk, just go with it, and he arrogantly invites the statue home for dinner. Then the statue comes down, the statue invites Don Giovanni. When Don Giovanni refuses, the statue drags him to hell, and he dies. You hear this eerie music associated with the statue that was established in the overture. So at the very beginning of the opera, you enter the theater, you sit down before any actors come on stage, the lights go dim, and you hear the orchestra play this instrumental piece of music with themes that will appear later in the show. So at the very beginning, we start to hear this theme that's eerie and kind of creepy, and we don't quite know what's going on. Well, that's the song of Don Giovanni being dragged down to hell at the very end. Thanks to Mozart's music, the righteous satisfaction at Don Giovanni's end is mixed with a good deal of sympathy for his high spirits, his bravery, and his determination to live by his own rules, not those of society, even if this dooms him. So again, he's not a perfect person, but he's not completely amoral. He has redeeming qualities. Are they forgivable? Probably not. I don't know. That's up for the audience to decide. It's just a fictional story anyway. But the point is, like a real person, he has good and bad qualities. This is important. This is something that you'll certainly want to write down in your notes. There are so many different genres of music in the opera Don Giovanni, and that's why the textbook authors, Kerman and Tomlinson, decided to emphasize it so much. We have an aria, Ho capito. We have a recitative, and we even have a duet sung between two people, and this duet is La ci darem la mano. So of course a duet is just when two people sing together. So in La ci darem la mano, that just means that we have two people singing, and that's different when you're writing that way. You have to write a conversation between two people, and you have to write it in a way where it flows naturally, but it's also an interesting piece of music to listen to. Well, that is it. Next week, we're going to jump into the 19th century. We're going to start with Beethoven, and then we're going to see how that carries over into the end of classical music, late classical music, which will become Romantic music, the next genre, the next era of this umbrella term, classical music. But that's it for this week. So I hope you enjoy all the listening examples as you get to listen to a lot of classical music, specifically some Haydn and some Mozart. Have a great week.